May you have a joy-filled Christmas. I'd like to pick up on the words of Pastor Short. We're talking this morning. He says he doesn't like wishing people Merry Christmas because sometimes it's not merry. But can always be joyful, which is our theme for this morning on this third Sunday of Advent. Sundays of Advent, kind of tradition have it, is that there's 4 themes through the 4 Sundays. The first Sunday of Advent is hope, the second one is peace, the third one is joy. And for reference, next week, the fourth is love, by the way, of joy. And it picks up on this very reading from Isaiah. And I want to go back to that very first verse again for you and just read that first verse from Isaiah 31, because that's what it really picks up on. It says, the wilderness and the dry land. Now, when you hear those words, what I need you to think of is if you've ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, the sand, or if you've seen pictures of just barren rock. I'm talking barren rock. I'm talking no vegetation, no scrub brushes, no bushes, no anything in here. There's probably more vegetation on this floor of this church than there is out there, what we're talking about, all right? So the wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert, same word. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. That's this version. The old version of that word was rose. Hence the third color of the third candle lit this morning on the Advent wreath is pink. Goes on. It shall blossom abundantly. If you were with us in the grace class, we use that word all the time in here. Abundantly, same word. And rejoice with joy and singing. Now think about it a second. What he's talking about here is he's talking about this barren landscape, this barren desert with nothing in it, suddenly blossoming like the Garden of Eden. And the rocks can't help at this improbable thing that God has done. The rocks themselves can't help but sing for joy. And that's what this week's message is about. Is this response of this improbable thing that God does in our world. And you know some of those stories. The Bible is full of some of those improbable things that God has done. Some of these improbable things that God has done is this story of John the Baptist and how the birth of John the Baptist came about, right? Is Zechariah and Elizabeth were very old, and they were sitting here, and Zechariah was in the temple, and the angel comes to Zechariah and says, you're going to have a son. And he disbelieves. And you know what happened there? He couldn't speak for 9 months. He comes out, and Elizabeth finds out in here. Joy is the response here. Joy is what Elizabeth is dealing with, suddenly having a child, but at the same time trying to figure out if Part B Medicare covers maternity benefits. Joy is the response of Mary when she's in here going out, and she's innocent girl. She's betrothed to be married to a wonderful young man. Everything's going to be great. They're going to have a nice, long, happy, peaceful, uneventful life in Nazareth. And suddenly one day the angel comes and says, oh, by the way, you're going to have the Son of God. Response to the improbable thing that God is doing. You see it in the gospel lessons as well. Gospel of John, Jesus is going through Jerusalem, and he goes by the pool. It's called Pool of Bethsaida, and there's a man that's been there for 38 years. A man who's been lame for 38 years. 38 years he can't walk. And every day for 38 years, somebody brings him over to the pool and sits there, and he can beg by the pool, try to get into the pool because they felt like if you could get into the pool at the right time, you could get healing. But he's missed out for 38 years. And then one day Jesus walks by and looks at him and says, do you want to walk? And he says, yes. And Jesus says, so get up. And the man stands up. the improbable things God does in our world. The improbable things God does in our world. He sits there, he's walking, Jesus is walking to Jerusalem that last week of his life. It's the day before Palm Sunday. He's going through Jericho, and he comes to a man who's been sitting on the side of the road all his life. His man's blind. His name's Bartimaeus. And all he can do on the side of the road is sit there and beg, because that's all he had, job he could find. Sitting there begging, and he's begging out, and he's shouting, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus goes, "Okay, get up and see." And the man gets up. For the first time in his life, he's able to see. First time he's able to see, and he watches and he sees Jesus die on a cross. Follows him to Jerusalem and die on a cross. For me, one of the most improbable ones there is he sits there and Jesus is going through Galilee, and he comes upon a man who's from birth. He was deaf at birth. And he can't hear. And because he's never been able to hear, he can't speak. And Jesus comes up to the man and he says, "Be healed." Now, here, you catch this? Who speaks to a deaf man? How improbable is this? Right? He speaks to a deaf man. But it's not just these Bible stories. It happens in our real life today. A lady by the name of Kristen Schwain. Many of you may know her. She does contemporary music over at St. Paul's in Jackson. She was a member here for a while and played in Jericho. She was pregnant with her second child. It was going to be a boy. Pregnant with her second child. She was about 17, 18 weeks. The doctors discovered there was a problem with her pregnancy. And the doctors down here sat there and said, "Kristen, we've got a problem with his pregnancy. You need to do something," parentheses, abortion. "You need to do something because it's not only going to cost the life of your child, it could very well cost your life too if you don't." And she refused to accept that. And making a longer story short, is today she's got a beautiful, about a 4-year-old baby boy. God does the improbable. But it's not simply these magnificent things. Sometimes the improbable things God does is the little things, right? As you sit there and you go to the doctor's office, or you get the message from the doctor and they say, we need to biopsy that. And then the doctor calls later and says, "Well, turned out to be nothing, don't worry about it." Right? Or maybe those improbable things that God has done occurs in your car. It's happened to me occasionally, right? You're driving down the road and all of a sudden something happens and you just react. You don't have time to think. You just react and realize you've missed the accident. Those improbable things that God does in our lives. And that response we're talking about this morning is that response that we have to the improbable things that God has done in your life, which is a question for you this morning. You can think about it as we're going through this morning. Is what improbable thing has God done in your life? What improbable thing has God done in your life? Because it's this thing on joy, this improbable thing, that response to the improbable thing that God has done. It's difficult to talk on joy on this Sunday, and maybe really any Sunday, because if you were watching the news, you know that there was another school shooting in Colorado on Friday. If you've watched the news, you realize yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School in here. And people have got stuff going on in life in here, and I'm not the only one here. Was talking with a man when I was in Texas this week. There was talking with a neighbor of my mom's, a man by the name of Carl. And we were just talking general and stuff. I've known him a long time, and he's sitting there And I kind of asked, so what are you doing for Christmas? Your family going to be here? What's going on? And he kind of just voluntarily shared, some of my family is going to be here and it's going to be okay, but sometimes Christmas is pretty lousy. He lost his wife about 3 years ago to cancer after a very long, difficult struggle. And I thought, guess what I'm talking about Sunday? Joy. But joy can go beyond that. Joy can go beyond that stuff that's going on. National Public Radio, you can find this article on National Public Radio's news site if you're interested in it. This article in here, it's about a lady by the name of Nelba Marquez Green. Nelba Marquez Green had a daughter, Anna, who was 6 years old, who was killed at Sandy Hook. And she sits there, and this is talking to her a year later and what she's experiencing. And she sits there and she says this in here. At the end of the day, I don't know why this happened. I didn't get to choose it, but I get to choose my response now. I do get to choose now. And in the midst of what's going on here, in the midst of the things happening, be they Sandy Hook or Colorado or whatever's happening in your life, what's going on, you need to understand something here, very serious here, is that sadness is not the opposite of joy. You hear that? Sadness is not the opposite of joy. Grief is not the opposite of joy in here. The opposite of joy is despair. The opposite of joy is that despair that goes on, that despair that can sink in. The opposite of joy is hopelessness. Is that hopelessness that there's no hope left in me, no hope left in the world. That's the opposite of joy. The opposite of joy is picking up from last week. The opposite of joy is when we attempt to go out and face the challenges of this world and do it not being connected to people, to not being connected with other brothers and sisters in Christ. We try to face this world by ourselves. That's a recipe for joylessness. Because joy is bigger than that. Joy is the response of God's people when He does the improbable. It's not necessarily the rah-rah. It's not necessarily sis boom bye. It's not necessarily everything's going to be great. Just put on a happy face because isn't it all wonderful? Sometimes it's not all wonderful. But joy is always there. Joy is always a part of us. Joy is always a part of who we are, and joy is always a part in our midst. Because there's a story you know really well. It's a story I started a minute ago, right? The story of Mary when she finds out she's pregnant. These improbable things that God has done. In this improbable series of circumstances, Mary ends up in Bethlehem with Joseph, and they have a child. She has baby Jesus in Bethlehem, and the angels come to the shepherds, right? How improbable is that? But the angels come to the shepherds, and the angels say to the shepherds, "Behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David who is Christ the Lord." That's the joy. God has come and God dwells in the midst of us. The Almighty Himself, the great I Am, the creator of the heavens and the earth, the one who led His people out of Egypt, the one who died to save us, has come down on this earth and dwells among us and continues to dwell among us. Those words, I am with you always, those words, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you, means not only He's with you, but that joy is with you as well. That joy is that down deep, that joy that transcends, and even though it may be hard in the world, that joy that transcends this world stays with us. 33 years later, the last thing the women saw, right? They saw Jesus' body wrapped up, wrapped in burial cloths and placed in a tomb. The last thing they saw that day was the stone rolled across the tomb. Remember? 3 days later, they go back out there expecting to finish the funeral. And Mary Magdalene did it best, right? They see Jesus. They realize that Jesus is alive. And they go out and they go back to the disciples, and the disciples see, and the disciples have the same thing. It's that wonder. It's that amazement. It's that marvel at what God has done. God has done the improbable. He's raised Jesus from the dead. They go out with joy. And they go out with joy into the world and spread that news. See, the thing is about joy, two parts of this joy. One, it lives and dwells with you and stays with you. It's part of who you are. We've talked about identity a whole lot around here lately. It's that identity we have in Jesus Christ, and we have that identity, that joy comes with it. Remember, it's not the rah-rah. Joy is deeper than that. But when that joy is inside, it can't help but get out. It can't help but get out. It can't help but be told. The disciples couldn't help but share the news. What did the shepherds do when they left, right? They told everybody they could see the wonderful things that God has done. In the face of what God did in the middle of the desert, right? And He turns this wilderness and this bare land into the Garden of Eden, going in here with everything blooming. Did you catch who's doing the rejoicing? At the improbable things God has done, even the rocks are going to sing. Which is how God leaves us. The improbable things, improbable that God has done is the probable in our lives. The improbable that God has done, that is the joy that we have. Our response is that joy. And it lives in us. It dwells in us. It shapes who we are and how we let people see it out in the world. Have a joy-filled and a joy-sharing Christmas. Amen.